Mhm. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I don't know how many of you felt the earthquake this morning. I thought it was a bulldozer coming through my house. I don't know what you guys thought. Good to see you. Those of you who didn't experience the earthquake, it was something else.
I felt it in New Brunswick and it was pretty harsh. Like the whole
Really?
apartment building was shaking. So
Yeah,
yeah, it definitely didn't feel like a construction for me.
really. Well, it didn't really feel like construction for me either, but I couldn't make sense of it. So I was like, well, it
Right,
must be
right.
construction. But yeah, it was something else. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just about a minute, just letting in a few people from the waiting room. Great to see everyone.
I think we admitted the first wave of people who are joining our Zoom
Okay.
meeting room. Do we want to get started, Melissa?
Yeah,
Introducing the group? Yes.
sure. Yeah, I'll just do a quick intro to get us started. So we're recording this session, just letting everyone know. Today's event is organized by the Rutgers Digital Ethnography Working Group, which is located in the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers University in New Jersey, United States. My name is Melissa Ranjit. I'm the co-founder of this group, along with Dr. Jeff Lane, who's also here on the call. And we have a wonderful steering committee made up of Professor Caitlin Petrie, Professor Yoni Rivera, and Professor Youngrim Kim, who is our host today, as well as our graduate coordinator, Dr. Holly Avella. Um, just before we get started, I want to say one or two words about the Digital Ethnography Working Group. This is a group that supports active digital ethnographers and researchers within the Rutgers Sky community and beyond. We try to support and promote member output and networking through our Duke website, our internal resources. We have meetings, we have regular writing groups, and of course, these public events. And we're thrilled to see you all here. As Young Rim moves through and introduces our guests today, I'm going to put our contact information and mailing list and stuff like that in the chat. Um, Let me just mention too, in terms of protocol, if you've been to our events before, you know that we tend to have like a very exciting live chat thing going on in the Zoom chat. So if you have any questions or comments during the talk, please just go ahead and put them in the chat as you think of them. We will monitor and keep track of the order of questions, and then we can ask those questions in the order in which they're received. Okay, let me cede the floor now to Young Rim. Thanks for organizing and hosting, Young Rim, and thanks, of course, to our panelists for being here today.
Thank you, Melissa, for this introduction. Just before we start, as security purposes, we're not allowing the audience to unmute themselves during the talk. But during the Q&A session, we can unmute you if you hold your hands up for if you'd like to ask for questions. So please bear that in mind as we move forward. First of all, thank you, Burcu and Chuncheng, for coming for this event. So the title of this the event is Ethnographies of the Datafied State. And this event really started off with our questions about governments today really actively developing and integrating these various digital and computational systems for governance purposes. So we diagnosed that a lot of governments today are transitioning into what Jenna Burrell and Ranjit Singh calls the Datafied State. And consequently, there is increased scholarly interest in studying these implications of algorithms, automation, and surveillance across governance and across civic life. And we invited these two panelists who are expert in this area, Burcu and Chuncheng, to explore the use of especially ethnographic methods in examining this complex relationship between statecraft and computation. So here in today's talk, we're going to think together through some of these challenging questions about how ethnography becomes useful for investigating the logic behind the building of these governance technologies, and also what kinds of labor becomes required to make these systems work, such as in terms of maintenance and repair. Also, we're curious what methodological challenges our panelists have encountered when they approach this topic with qualitative and ethnographic approaches. So our panelists, Dr. Burcu Baykurt and Dr. Chuncheng Liu, will explore these themes through cases of smart city developments in the US and social credit systems in China. So specifically introducing Dr. Burcu Baykurt. She's an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her research examines how digital infrastructures reshape and perpetuate durable inequalities. She's currently working on a book called Smart as a City, which is based on her fieldwork in aspiring smart cities in the United States. Dr. Chuncheng Liu is a postdoctoral researcher at Microsoft Research in New England, and he is also an assistant professor, incoming assistant professor at Northeastern University starting from this fall. His research focuses on the socio-technical production of data and classifications in authoritarian states. Specifically, he's currently working on an ethnography of social credit system, a data-driven governance infrastructure in China. So I asked our two panelists to first spend 20 to 25 minutes speaking about their own individual work, and then we can open it for Q&A, speaking about any questions about methodologies, theoretical perspectives, and studying the Datafied State. So why don't we start with Dr. Burcu Baykurt?
Thank you, Young Graham. Apologies that I don't have slides, or maybe it's good. I don't know. I personally don't like slides, so I'm just gonna talk somewhat freely. But before, I want to thank you for inviting me. I feel like I want to get this on the record that I've been a fan of this group since day one, and you guys have managed to gather, I don't want to say all, but like the most of my favorite scholars in the field. This group has a special place in my heart. So when Youngbrim reached out, this was probably one of the fastest yeses this semester to be in conversation on the Datafied State. And it was a fast yes also because I heard that Chuncheng was gonna join me, and we met a few years ago, I feel like at the height of the pandemic, virtually. I never met in person, but I feel like I've been a fan of his research for even a longer time. So I'm delighted to be in this conversation. And especially I'm delighted to be nerding out over ethnography with you all. So I want to tackle the first part of the prompt, which is like how ethnography becomes useful for investigating the logic and labor behind building or maintaining the Datafied State. And for that, I decided to focus on what I consider to be three utilities of an ethnographic approach to the Datafied State. And through those three uses or utilities, I'm going to introduce some of my own projects over the last few years. And I'm happy to sort of talk more about the challenges and the details of those projects in the second part of the panel. So the first, I would say the use or utility of ethnography in studying the Datafied State for me is to dispel the myth of the state. And I want to underline the here. And especially in the context of the Datafied version, I think an ethnographic approach really is useful, challenging the myth around this so-called well-oiled data machine. So to prepare for this talk, I went back to what I consider to be some of the classics, Michel Rolfe-Trouillot's Close Encounters of the Deceptive Kind, and Philip Abrams's essay, Notes on the Difficulty of Studying the State. So I highly recommend those two for those of you who are interested in studying the state. And these authors both talk against, I would say, the institutional and geographical fixity of the state, like the question of where do you find the state in your research? But I think they also really acknowledge the perhaps not so useful, but really real urge to figure out the backstage of these agencies. And I think in their own way, they both also remind us that most of the time we are disappointed when we kind of unveil the backstage. I'm going to quote Philip Abrams here, who says, "So often when the gaff is blown, the official secrets turn out to be both trivial and theoretically predictable." And he's writing this in 1988, but I think in the era of the black boxed, opaque, datafied state, we have the risk of falling into this trap of reifying the power of the state, of computing, due to these access and lack of transparency issues. But I'm going to argue that ethnographers know better. So let me illustrate what I mean by this. I spent the years between 2015 and 2018 in Kansas City, Missouri, where the mayor's office had partnered with Cisco, Sprint, and several other smaller tech firms to test a smart city pilot. I was able to observe not just how these different stakeholders came together and literally built the smart city downtown, but also had to grapple with the challenges of what I consider to be like to make it work. How does the datafied state come into being and function was a big part of my fieldwork. And breakdowns, glitches, not understanding how technology works, not knowing what to do with it were very much part of my and these public officials' everyday experience. One might argue if a US municipality would qualify as the state, but I think it was definitely a case of what it means to try to govern with data. And I think if you're interested in any sort of public agency, you come across this problem. So my interlocutors often try to project an image of like they knew what they were doing, but there were so many mistakes and misunderstandings in the process. And I don't talk about this in a way that exceptionalizes this case or dismisses the expertise of these public officials. But it is true, perhaps ironically, that ignorance was very much part of the smart city as these public officials were trying to govern with data. And this ignorance partly was systemically produced because tech companies were very reluctant to share information. And some of it was actually deliberate because city officials and some of the local entrepreneurs they were collaborating with were very eager to performatively forget their existing problems and political challenges in the name of unlocking this creative potential of smart technologies, about which they did not know much, I have to say. And I highlight this aspect from my fieldwork because if you've ever studied any public agency or as a citizen or even as a non-citizen, you might have experienced a version of, well, the computer said so in your interaction with the government, right? Like whenever you try to dispute something that you consider to be a mistake or an aberration. My personal example is that there was a period in my life I used to be flagged at the US border to go through secondary screening. And every time I asked like why this was happening, the border agent used to say like, I don't know, the computer said so. So I'm just kind of following the orders here. So this phrase gives the impression that there's some knowledge that I wasn't privy to, but that sort of clearly explained why I deserve to be flagged, for example, or why that mistake had to happen. And I think this is what like Abrams called the sort of hidden reality of politics, or the institutionalization of political power that ostensibly resists discovery. But I think, anyone who's in media studies or in science and technology studies also could acknowledge that it might just be an error or a very deliberate attempt to mark me, I think, in the most tactless way possible based on my background. But either way, like the computer, while offering perhaps a convenient excuse in the moment, was also showcasing how those border agents or street level bureaucrats, the representatives of the state, did not always know what they were doing and were not that perhaps powerful, but using the computer as a clutch to prop up the state power. And I highlight these because I think most of the time when you study the state, we focus on the legitimacy aspect, like whether we believe these statements or not, kind of stuff. But there is, if I could highlight the Gramscian in me, there is this aspect also of like turning us into subjects or subjecting us to like ways of doing from the state's perspective in terms of like whether we accept the computing as a valid response, like what is the computer said so doing in that case, like not only in terms of legitimacy, but also in communicating the power and capacity of the state. What are the ways that these technologies are allowing ethnographers to see how state power is dramatized in those everyday encounters, I think is a good way to think about like what we can bring to the conversation. And I would say beyond theorizing the datafied state, to question the state in general. So the second, and I think this use and utility is like better known, the making of the datafied state, especially for ethnographers, offers a great opportunity to see up close what's counted and how. So both in the Smart City project and my later research on COVID-19 dashboards in US cities, I was able to see the backstage and the labor of trying to put together these dashboards, creating categories, refining them, updating them, tweaking them based on feedback, and as well as sort of responding to the political pressures and the changes in the evolution of the public health crisis too. So I think, as Younger mentioned, the question of maintenance and repair comes up a lot in this context, because that's also partly a big chunk of like public officials' everyday life, like how to maintain these systems, how to make interventions when something breaks down. And an ethnography of the datafied state would highly benefit from studying these more mundane, seemingly less contentious parts of upkeep, and what kind of work that constitutes. Because at the end, I really think these are like very political and socially and culturally shaped decisions too. And I want to like highlight here, I think in our world or our subfield, the question of legibility and governance comes up a lot, right? The sort of Jim Scott's overly cited seeing like a state. And I would say, like, for ethnographers of the datafied state, there's a potential here to go even further and understand the degrees of resolution when it comes to the seeing. So the COVID-19 dashboards were a great example of how zooming in on a zip code or breaking down, say, like hospitalization rates into different categories of gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and I would say even age, always had very different political decisions behind them. And those political decisions were not always big P politics, like ideologically driven or partisan, but also had a lot to do with small P politics, like around the lack of resources, the fear of making public mistakes and receiving potential backlash, or not trusting the accuracy of numbers coming from different stakeholders and not wanting to, put those good enough numbers out there, because I think all public officials around the world are so afraid of losing the trust of their, publics. Third, I think a datafied state, especially from an ethnographic angle, lays bare the ever-blurring lines between the state and markets. And this brings me to my more recent project on GovTech companies in the tech industry. I'm right now focusing on the United States, but I'm very open to hearing from other places if what I'm about to describe resonates with you. So GovTech firms are typically small to mid-sized startups that provide government agencies with expertise in data science and software for analyzing and visualizing public information. Some of them are very specific. They focus on things like curb management or property code enforcement, while others are kind of a little bigger, and they offer a range of services in data-centric services related to housing, transportation, or public health. Their day-to-day business relies on wading through public agencies' existing data sets, digitizing old maps, going through tax code or fee structures, really mundane, really, if I could use this word, boring stuff. And all they provide is just trying to digitize or automate them, nothing necessarily hyped or so-called innovative in the way that the tech industry tries to pretend. And they peddle their services as a means to streamline data-driven decision-making and building civic information tools for the public. And this routine administrative work, as you might imagine, is very valuable for cash-strapped public agencies. But the commercial value for these GovTech terms does not only come from selling their software and expertise to local governments, but also from claiming a stake in public revenues and creating new products out of it. So I'll give you a couple examples. If a company is providing a digital payment infrastructure system to a public agency, say to process parking fees, they take a cut from it. Or they combine different publicly available free data sets and turn it into a proprietary data or insights, and then sell that, license that to other public agencies or private companies. So with this project, I pay attention to, obviously the rise of these firms doesn't at all mean that there's an erosion of state capacity, but I think they invite us to understand how this new economy is reconfiguring the state itself. And as ethnographers, we need to better understand what's happening in these somewhat subtle and often messy processes of transformation, because these partnerships have the potential or have already, changed the meaning of the public interest, turning a welfare service into an optimization, into a case of optimization, for example. That's a big qualitative change in the meaning of the public interest. And then they also change how decisions of distribution and bias service delivery are made here. And I highlight this because there are scholars who, ethnographically or not, who study the automated welfare systems or automated decision-making systems. Especially in popular media, we see a lot of coverage around this. But most of the attention seems to be on the biases and how these systems are prone to misidentifying people or wrongly depriving people of what they are owed to. But I really believe there is more than the biases that we need to pay attention to here, because the datafication of the state goes hand in hand with its further privatization. And we need to ethnography is a great tool to unpack the nuances in this process and in what ways this is different than what has been going on before or not. All right, so to sum up, dispelling the myth of the state and the myth around well-functioning databases or automated decision systems, paying attention to how categories are made and how places and people are counted, and in what degrees of resolution the state chooses or is capable of seeing, and then examining how the state responsibilities and activities are interlinked with private interests and profit-making objectives as the datafication continues, are these three things that I think ethnographers could really bring to better understanding this new phenomenon. or tell us how new some of this is, and generate new questions as we move forward. So let me just stop here, and then we can discuss the challenges in the second part.
Thank you for this so thought-provoking presentation, Burcu. Let's move on to Chuncheng. Do you want to share your slides, Chuncheng?
Okay. Hi. I hope there's not that many noises in my background. Apparently, the library at Yale is a very popular tourist site. Anyway, can you see that? Okay. Hi. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for for inviting me to this group. I'm a colleague of Zoe, so of course I know this for a long time. But to be honest, I didn't. I somehow feel this is a nice, cute little group, but apparently this is. So it's kind of terrifying to speak to this many people, and it's under the recording. But yeah, so and also I always have this kind of imposter syndrome when talking about ethnography. So I'm a sociologist by training, and I have a lot of anthropology friends who is very guarded regarding the use of the term ethnography. One thing, for example, is they always make fun of me for claiming, not about my own research, but about any sociologists who claim use to ethnography if they did anything less than a year, or if they didn't go to faraway places and just erase their identity for a significant amount of time, which is definitely not what I do. I end up did 10 months ethnography. So I'm still a little bit not sure, should I call it? I don't know. But here I am talking about ethnography and Datafied State. So today I'm going to talk about following data in an authoritarian state. So as my following kind of talk would show, so following data is the kind of approach I adopted. Authoritarian state is a very important context of my own study, but I do believe that the kind of challenges that I will show here does not only restrain to authoritarian state, but also any complicated private company nowadays. Okay, so wait, what? Okay, so let's start. Let's start from everyone's favorite person on Earth, Soros. Well, I put him here because I study social policy system, and social policy system is what basically initiated by the Chinese central government in 2014, which caused a lot of kind of controversy overseas, especially Soros kind of comments here represent one particular understanding of Chinese social policy system, which is with the power of machine learning, big data, artificial intelligence, all those technology we can imagine. The state, especially authoritarian state, becomes so powerful in controlling and surveilling and repressing human rights in authoritarian regime, which I will show is, it's not really the case at all. So how do we think about social credit system, first of all? So in principle, all credit systems are kind of rating systems that deal with the information asymmetrical problems. So put it simply, they are kind of reputation system, right? So for example, when you think about when you meet a stranger, you are trying to figure out if she's trustworthiness or not. So in the past, you can ask mutual friends or acquaintance about their judgment regarding this person you didn't know. And then you can get either that person's good or not, and then make your decision afterwards. But as we live in a more complicated and society of strangers, it's just really hard to have this kind of more interpersonal approach. And that's where all those algorithms, those companies come into being. They kind of, the division of labor of them is just to create information and then make the judgment for all of the strangers we might encounter in society, and we can use their system's judgment as a kind of shortcut to know if someone is trustworthy or not. So Chinese social credit system can be understood as this kind of algorithmic system that collected and processed data to produce evaluation for individuals or organizations for different purposes. So since 2014, multiple social credit system has been established in China. But unlike the credit system in the United States, such as FICO, which we are more familiarized with, some Chinese social credit systems are more ambitious in terms of governing those more blurry social domains, which means the kind of expansion of what kind of data to be collected from the financial field to social field. So particularly some social credit system trying to govern those everyday behaviors, which is what my case about. So my case is a social credit system in northern China, which is considered as one of the most well-implemented social credit system in China. So every maritime residents have a default credit score of 1,000 points, which can be adjusted by about 400 different indicators. Those scores is associated then with some kind of different benefits and punishment, mostly supported by the local government, including fast channel to access to government service or suspension from their work. So to give you a better sense of what kind of sort of behavior that this kind of social credit system governs, so here is part of the translated metrics. By the way, all those metrics are publicized because that's the point, to make people understand which kind of behavior is encouraged and which is not, so they can behave accordingly. Well, ideally, right? Ideally, this is the kind of the ultimate Foucauldian code book for governance. So here, is some translated indicators to show what kind of diverse political, economic, social, legal behaviors are included. And they also kind of trying to establish this kind of data sharing protocol and network among different state agencies, from the court, from traffic police. Their idea, again, is to have this more centralized data processing center inside of the state and produce a more comprehensive and what they call scientific evaluation of individuals' trustworthiness. But of course, it doesn't work like that. I think as we all know, kind of any ethnographer of the state would know immediately that the whole state doesn't really exist, and the ultimate goal of the state doesn't really function at all most of the time, not because of the societal pressure, but because of the internal hierarchy and organizational problems that inside of the state, which I will talk about later. But before that, I want to talk more about the authoritarian context that I'm trying to talk about. So what does it mean? So this could mean two things for one's field work, right? So the first one is that the state can just eliminate your access for your field site, just like that, like it's gone. So originally my dissertation research, so all of these are from my dissertation research. Originally, my dissertation research is a comparative study of a credit system that I just talked about in maritime as a government-centered social credit system, as well as a market-centered credit system that was established by the Datafied, which is basically adjacent to Alibaba. But basically 6 months before I trying to start my field work, Jack Ma, the CEO of Alibaba, did an internal speech criticizing the Chinese financial regulator for being too harsh on fintech, which apparently annoyed the regulator, and basically in 1 month, Ant Finance was on the edge of going to public, and they have the largest IPO in history. All of those things suspended all of my gatekeeper that I was having conversation with about me doing interview and ethnography there, talking that, okay, it's impossible to do any research now because it's just too sensitive. Guess what next? Everything is changed, right? So I have to basically cut my comparative study into a case study, which to some extent I think is easier to talk in the terms of ethnography. But for me, I was very, I was just a graduate student who was terrified about what's happening next at that point. And the second thing is of the kind of authoritarian context means that even if you could do your field work, you need to be very careful, especially when you're dealing with the state agencies. So of course there's a paranoia about social credit system in China, like Soros, the way Soros talk about. Again, it's definitely not true at all, but it's just really hard to evaluate if I can actually do this field work or not when I was in the United States. So again, it's it's just very tricky to figure out how can I figure out if I could have access, how could I figure out if I'm not going to be in trouble when I'm doing this field work, and especially considering I'm not a US citizen. So like, for US citizens, the biggest trouble you can get is you cannot do your research. Fine, maybe just 1 more year for you to stay in the graduate program. For I'm a Chinese citizen, I don't have that protection. So so how should I figure out if my field work is sensitive? How should I figure out if Chinese social credit system is sensitive? Is something that I've been basically dealing with for months before I actually went back to China to do my field work. To some extent, let's see. Okay, yes. To some extent, it also helped me to understand Max Weber's arguments better, because I think the audience here should know his argument regarding the Protestant theories about how this kind of predeterminist idea of whether you are safe or not really reshape their behavior and leads to the merging of capitalist society. But for me, it's like what the key point here I feel resonant with this writing is I really trying to figure out, just like all those four Protestants trying to figure out if they were safe or not, I really trying to figure out if the Chinese state think social credit system was sensitive or not. But just like there's no God telling you are safe or not for Protestants, there's no the Chinese government telling me if I can do my field work or not, right? I start to look for signs, just like the good Protestants. I try to look at social media in China, I try to talk to people. But again, all those kind of information I got is kind of contradictory to each other. Like eventually I just decided, okay, I got it. Like it really just depends, right? What does it mean? It depends. It means that there is no ultimate answer there to be revealed once, it's not like a white binary kind of thing. Once I enter the field work, I will know immediately, and then I can make my decision accordingly. I as an ethnographer is part of the to some extent to the defining process of whether my field work is sensitive or not. Which means I need to think about how should I interact with people in different positions. Like I am to some extent part of the problem. And one of the very obvious example is, which I learned later on, that social credit system is not sensitive at all for Chinese bureaucrats. What is sensitive is my own affiliation with the US universities in this kind of age where US-China relationship is very tricky. So, it's like the problem is not about the object of my research, it's about me, it's about who do the research and interacting with whom, with what kind of information. But it also means that, it depends on the situation, about who I interact with, what time I interact with them, and in what kind of situation. So which again, like we ethnographer knows all of this. It's not about authoritarian state, it's not about whatsoever, like all those theory regarding positionality, about reflection, about co-construction, whatsoever, you can all through it here. We know it, but like I also want to point out it's just really hard as a graduate student at that point to do all those kind of effective labor to trying to figure out. And this is something I think is especially worth to consider, considering we are kind of trying to encouraging new generation of research to be conducted about China, about a lot of different countries nowadays. How can we help them? How can we help young scholars to deal with those more structural issues? It's very important. Okay. So let me just move to the kind of my what I want to talk about, how to do this kind of research regarding datafied state. I just very conveniently call it following the data, which I do not claim to kind of coin this term at all. Yeah, so this means follow really means to follow the production, connection, evaluation, transformation, and use of data throughout the life cycle of the data, right? So data, of course, is not really self-produced, evaluated, translated, or used. The key is to kind of follow the people, organization, technologies, institution around the data from across different stages to document it, how information and context become translated and to some extent untranslatable. So why does this matter? So I only want to highlight 2 points here. So first of all is, this approach really highlights the kind of context of data, right? So although people tend to believe that data speaks for itself, speaks for its own truth, or the power of data is about its ability to decontextualize from one place to another. Data, again, I feel this group of people have known this long before already is very local, right? So those network of people, organization, technologies that working with data in different kind of social scenario really impact, if we use a favorite word from anthropology, ontology of the data in different social scenario. So second of all is this approach really highlight the instability of the data. So this again should not be surprised by any ethnographer or SDS scholars. Most classic both the body multiple really greatly demonstrated how following the same object across different contexts, even just different doors at the same hospital, really can reveal the different ontologies of the object that we think might be the same thing. So let's go back to Maritime then. So if we look at the volume of data that the social credit system collected, it looks great. So in 2020, they basically collected about 60,000 data per month, considering it only have about like, let's say 800,000 residents there. It's quite impressive records in terms of data protection. However, if you look carefully about what kind of data are actually produced, you will realize they are extremely limited. So there are almost no negative data collected by the system. The system I just saw, the social system is supposed to be a kind of system that includes both negative and positive records. There are actually more negative indicators in the metrics than the positive one. But in the data collection, there's almost no negative records at all. Over 80% of those data are about the government-sponsored volunteer activities, and all those data are basically collected only concentrated within 20% of the population in the city. So to some extent, it's a system that is seemingly working to collect data, but it's not really working as intended, as what we might thought the system was intended to be, or it's not really working as what we think any of the functional data-driven governance system should work. So, ethnography, the good thing about it is that you can really just follow the data in translation across different social scenarios, right? So from 2019 to 22, I stayed there for 10 months conducting ethnography. And I also collected more than 100 interviews with the government officials, bureaucrats and residents with different background. So, context is really everything. And context is really everything, and it doesn't really, show up in paper or show up in those dashboard we saw at the front end of the government, like digital government system. So again, this is the advantage of doing ethnography. So I basically shadowed all those staff who actually collect, document, and report data in everyday basis. It can really reveal kind of what kind of human labors are supporting this kind of system. And sometimes we found out a lot of kind of unexpected human labor that was actually involved in all those data work. So for example, here in this third picture, I was like posing like basically posing in the pictures, which I didn't realize was actually very important data work for social credit system there, because all the data records, all those bureaucrats are collected and uploaded has to be supported with basically visual evidence. And so when I was doing that, I was basically that picture was basically used as a supporting documents to show that the local government, local bureaucrats organize volunteer events to clean the neighborhood, especially clean the building, inside of building. And I was supposed to be an anonymous resident who's really impressed by the government work, right? So like all those kind of things also impact how they work, because that's a lot of work. That's just a lot of work to actually do it. So what they end up is to do all those things that is easier to collect it, and that is, to some extent, doesn't need to have more controversial, because they don't want to leave any traces for some local residents to kind of challenge. So that's also why they end up only kind of collect data from a specific small group where they can control and they know each other. So it kind of decrease the kind of paperwork they have to prepare to supporting the datafication. And this is exactly what kind of ethnography would do to study Datafied State, because again, if I wasn't there, I wouldn't even know they have this kind of weird system and how this weird system can impact datafication. And also all those bureaucrats who collected all those social data are local residents as well, right? So they really want to maintain a good relationship with the residents, and that's why they don't really want to collect any negative data fit into the system. Which again, falling back to what kind of data do they collected in action. I just really want to go back to Brooke's early point about the whole point. Well, maybe not the whole point, but very important point of using ethnography to study the state is to demystify the state, because it really, really what is the state? The more I study it, the more I'm unsure about. So the state is kind of nowadays, I feel some theorists think the state as a fact, some assembly of different organizations. Now I feel more like the state is a field in the Burrellian sense to some extent, where a lot of contested actors exist in the similar social space to trying to perform and enact, but essentially contested to each other. So thinking about the data that social credit system collected, it means very, very differently to different actors inside of the state. So for the politicians who develop this system, this is a showcase that they want to use to impress their supervisors. So they don't really care about what kind of data collected. They only care about how many data they collected. For different municipal agencies inside of that area, with who are supposed to contribute the data to the social credit system, they think data as their own valuable resources that they do not want to share with others because of all those jurisdiction kind of war happening inside of the state, which again kind of significantly limited what kind of the data the social credit system could have. And for the grassroots bureaucrats collect all those data, this is just some tasks they do every day. They do not want to lose their job, but they also do not want to annoy their neighbors they live with for more than decades, right? So yeah, I think I'm a little bit running out of time, so I'm just gonna two more simple points eventually, which again, I don't think this is something unique to anyone study Datafied State, because this is just some traditional tricks of ethnography, which is, you follow the people, right? So you expand your network when you are in the field work, and I think mapping out how data circulate inside of state is very helpful for you to know who do you want to connect next. So for example, I end up talking with the director of the social credit system there, because I made a friend with a local bureaucrat who has an uncle working next to the social credit system office building, and they brought up they have beer sometimes, and I say, oh, why don't I come to your office and visit your uncle and have a chat with the person I actually want to talk with? And she said, yeah, why not? Like, so I end up going there, right? So like, again, this is a kind of tricks that all ethnographer has to play. But I think it's very in this kind of mystifying hype of current discussion regarding data, state, yada, yada, yada. I think it's very important to still remember that those are network of people that you can to some extent invade and to take advantage and flow with them to get more data you actually need. And lastly, I just want to say, think about different data all the time. State is a very particular, well, no matter how, we sociologists like to talk about how generalizability of our research, but state is a very particular organizations that have a lot of limits in terms of, when you can get access, what kind of access can you get, and those things can change due to internal politics or external pressure. So always, especially be open-minded regarding what kind of fieldwork you want to do, what kind of data you want to use. So I end up, basically combining all those methods I can do from national survey, archive study to ethnography interview, just to answer the question I really want to ask. And I think keeping this open-minded is especially important when we study organization, the mystifying organization like the state. Okay, I think that's all I want to say. Again, thank you very much for offering this opportunity. I'm very excited about the conversation.
Thank you so much, Chuncheng, and also Burcu for these so thought-provoking, constructive kind of, brainstorming sessions, thinking about what the benefits and limitations of ethnographies and studying the Datafied State. And there were very much a lot of intersections and discussion points kind of came across both of your presentations, thinking about what is the state and who are we actually, approaching and talking to in order to make sense of the workings of the state is really something that kind of struck me as a kind of common thread line in both of your presentations. So we are going to open up for Q&A, and before there are a few questions already made in the chat. Please feel free to type in your questions in the chat. Also, please feel free to just hold your hands up. I will unmute you if you want to ask questions directly. But before I open this up to the general floor, I have a couple of questions that I want to kind of kick off this discussion about the challenges of ethnographies and studying the Datafied State. So both of you have really wonderfully talked about your experience of accessing these individuals, your experience of interacting with bureaucrats, with state officials. But knowing that there is a lot of graduate students also in this talk who is actually like doing the work right now, working on their dissertation, starting to design their field work. I just wanted to hear more from both of you on your experiences with interacting with this very unique set of interlocutors, right? Bureaucrats, state officials. So I just wanted to hear more about how you actually access them. How is it? Was there any unique challenges in getting access and getting consent from these people to speak with you? And also knowing that these bureaucrats and state officials, Burcu, you mentioned that they are many times performative, right? They have somehow like textbook manuals on how to respond to reporters, to the wider general public. So how do we kind of understand the behind the lines of what they're actually speaking about, like going a little bit further than what they would speak to the reporters or to the media in general. And Chuncheng, you spoke about, your positionality as a US-based researcher in interacting with local Chinese people, and how that kind of creates unique challenges for you in the conversations that you make with the people in China. So I just wanted to hear more about your challenges in interacting with these people. How did you kind of thought about your own positionality as a person who's studying about China, as a person who is in the US-based institution?
I go first? Great questions. The access part is interesting because on the one hand, I didn't have much problem, even though I'm from Turkey. The Kansas City was like, my fieldwork was the first time I spent in Kansas City. I had zero friends, zero connections. Like there were many days when I actually, while recognizing the challenges like Chuncheng talked about, there are many days where I kind of wondered like, oh, maybe I should have done this work in Turkey, like in a Turkish city where I would know the people, even though, politically there would be other like real risks involved. I think the part of the reason why I didn't have much trouble was because my perception of what was going on there was very different than what the local government was thinking what they were doing, at least at the start. Like, so they were very excited about the fact that like someone was going to be there the whole time taking notes. Like people were actually like over time joking about like I'm glad we have someone here who's going to tell this like success story, down the line. Like people were like genuinely excited to have me around, which is a, like very lucky and privileged position to have, but I can't really claim to any tricks. I really just cold emailed people. I relied on the strangers' recommendations to like track people down. So the access part was like, yeah, there were no tricks for me necessarily other than just being really stubborn and persistent about it, I guess. But the performativity part was like really challenging and generative, I would say, because in the first 6 months of my research, every time I sat down with a public official, it was also during a time when I was trying to understand what this project was about. I'm listening to them, asking questions, coming home, typing up notes. And then over time, I noticed that I was making mistakes about like asking questions. Like I'm saying that, oh, I hear that these sensors will collect X data. And then I talk to the other person, they're like, no, it doesn't. Like, that's not what it does. And I, as a grad student at the time, I was kind of like, oh, like, shoot, like I clearly did not do my homework well. I'm not understanding this technology. And then I think on my own, I noticed that no, my interlocutor did not fully know what was going on. And all the stuff that they were telling me was, it wasn't hearsay, but like it was definitely like bits and pieces of reality rather than the full picture. So once I noticed that, like that actually became like a data point, because like how can you build, it wasn't like a huge project, but a somewhat sizable public-private partnership while everyone has like such little and partial information about it. That actually became really instructive in that sense. And I still go back and look at my early notes and I'm like, oh, like I can't believe they told me this, or like finding out the technical misunderstandings that they had, and the fact that like they were fed, some of them at least were fed this false information by tech companies. And I don't know, I know why, but like they didn't have any follow-ups, or they didn't ask a lot of questions. Like all of those insecurities that I experienced at the start of my fieldwork actually became really important, crucial insights into how these things get done and how they, are destined to be failures from the get-go. So let me just stop here.
Yeah, I really want to just keep building on this great point. So also like circular system is not sensitive exactly because it's not a system. It's not a civilian system in the way we think what civilian system do. And it's full of actually performative works, paper works about data fabrication that I talk about in my book project, ongoing book project, which hasn't opened for a while. Oh shit. Yeah, but it's actually very, very interesting to think about why do those people need to do a lot of performative work if we're introducing the more organizational perspective in to understand what kind of work do they need to do. Understand like those new fancy datafied whatsoever it sounds very exciting to a lot of people, but for a lot of bureaucrats who has to do the work, it's just another layer of their boring daily routine work. They just submit in different forms into different kind of system, right? So for them, I still remember when I first got into fieldwork and talking with people what I do, and I thought, oh, they're gonna say, ooh, that sounds so sensitive, like don't do it. Like, but their reaction is, oh, that's so boring. Like, why are you studying this boring stuff? Like, are you sure you are like you can graduate from this project? And I was like, oh, okay, good. I guess, you know, because them knowing me doing boring stuff also means I wouldn't be perceived as some, you know, some spy just looking around and trying to steal the biggest secret of Chinese government from a middle of nowhere village. So that's actually very helpful. And also, you know, perspective work also at first makes me very anxious because it made me feel, oh, like this, my project is not going anywhere because it's not really, they are not really collecting the data I thought they should collect or whatsoever. But then I think I also have this kind of moment when I realize, oh, that was a wrong way of thinking about this phenomena. Like, all those performative labor is actually exactly the point. It's just because we misunderstood what's the point of such system from the beginning, right? So I think that's the kind of, again, I feel this is what ethnography really is really important, because you really have to be there to understand why they do what they do and how they do it. And going back to your question, yeah, so my uncle, after knowing my my research project, his first reaction is, are you working for CIA right now? Right. So like I don't, well, for the record, I don't. But this is something people would think about me after knowing that, you know, again, as a US as a student who studied in a US institution, any kind of acquiring information, trying to understand what's happening on the ground in China is considered as sensitive. And I don't really have a solution for that as well. I just like one useful way to do is to find some local collaborator or local institutions that can actually support you. You know, it's to some extent, academia is more globalist in most contexts, and it's easy for you to communicate your research with, for example, sociology or political science professor inside of China. They would understand because this is what they do as well. They know you are not trying to spy on anything, right? So if you can get local support from them, and if they are willing to give you some local affiliation, that would be extremely helpful. But also just to think about how do you want to approach to the state, right? So there are two approaches. One is to, you know, if I study a municipal government, one approach is just eye contact with the mayor of the municipal government. And if he say yes, okay, all the problems is gone because I have that letter. But if he say no, like there's no way I could enter that place because of he already said no. So another approach then is to kind of bottom up, right? So like again, thinking about state not as a kind of as one unity stuff that you can get only answer once. You can try different lower ranked official, lower ranked institution and start from there, working with them, trying to make them understand that at least not annoyed by your existence. And then from time to time, they are used to it and they are more open to what they are actually doing. And it's, you know, but at that time, you can start to more expand your network. So that's what I found has been more helpful.
Thank you both of these wonderful answers. I have like tons of other follow-up questions coming up, but I'm seeing a lot of questions on the floor, but also on the chat. So I'm going to move on and open the Q&A to the entire group. So why don't let's start with Froom Wong, who has her hand up in the Zoom room, and then I'll move to the questions to the chat. So I'll unmute Froom. I think you can speak now.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. your presentation on the big data within the authoritarian states. I have two questions after your lectures. The first one is, do you consider that the big data collections from the citizen, do you consider that as a necessity for the social structure development in China? And the second one is, assuming you collect all the data of the let's say your neighbor didn't shovel the feces of your pet, he got -5 social credit. So did you obtain all of these data's numbers from China? Because according to my knowledge, because I was on the similar topics, according to my knowledge, these data are not open or not easy to obtain within China, within the China mainland. Did you obtain it from China mainland, or simply based on other researchers? I would like to hear your opinions. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't get the second question. What kind of data were you referring to?
I'm referring to the data. So like you didn't do something that is good for the social to the society, and somehow you got like -5, -10 to your social credits originally credit.
Yeah, those data, yeah, they are not really collected most of the time because the kind of the all those data. So think about in this way. So all those interpersonal and more deep, like all those more social data are harder to collect, and they have to rely on the kind of the bureaucrats that are more embedded in the local network. But this creates a kind of contradictory, because if you are more embedded in the local network, like it's less likely for you to actually, to some extent, betray your peers to report all those information to the state that you don't really care about, because they are the lowest ranked bureaucrats, right? So eventually what they do is they just don't do it. They just collect, because the bureaucrats have a quota. The bureaucrats have to collect like 20% the data entrance that equals to 20% of the local residents. So they end up just uploading all those positive records to finish their task without actually collecting any negative data. So that's the kind of, there's other kind of mechanism why they do that, but like this is the kind of most obvious kind of reason why it end up being like this. And your first question, so whether data collection is a necessity for the Chinese governance, well, like data collection is necessity for any government's governance everywhere. This go back to this kind of classic arguments saying like state, the whole point of the state to act, to intervene in society is based on what they can see, and what they can, only when they can see, they can do things, right? So the way of organizing society to make it more legible or whatsoever is all kind of working in this way of doing. And I would say this is a function of the state. Yeah.
Let's now move into the, a lot of questions are pouring into the chat. So there is a question from Timothy Pachurat. Do you want to ask this question yourself, or I can also read from the chat?
I'm happy to do it either way. Just to follow up on the last set of questions, I think the question may not have been about how people collect the data that was in your table, but where you got the data that comprised the table itself, like how you got the data on the point structure. And I believe the questioner may have been saying that they don't believe that information is readily available inside of mainland China. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for the clarification. So yeah, they have it's kind of semi-public data. So they basically so there are two ways there are two sources of data how I made that table. One is there are semi-public data regarding how many records do we collect every month, and there are some more, to some extent, more internal data regarding the kind of distribution of what kind of indicators were used. And again, the benefits of doing ethnography is like when you become friends with them, they are willing to talk more, and it also means they are willing to share more kind of paperwork with you. Actually, I feel this is another very important things to think about the state is like state is tons of paperwork. So if you can get access to some folders, it really helps you to advance your understanding of what's going on there.
I also really appreciate Timothy's first question that speaks about the relationship between datafication and the nature of sovereignty. So I'll repeat this question for the sake of our panelists. Does datafication simply serve as a prop for existing modes of state power, or does it also change the nature of state or the nature of sovereignty? When, if ever, do increasing resolutions of legibility lead to qualitative shifts in the nature of the states?
So Timothy, unsurprisingly, asks us really big questions that I will not be able to answer in its full deserving scope. But I think like there's something in the question that I want to maybe highlight. And maybe this is what like Chuncheng and I were trying to articulate from the very beginning. Like when we look at the Datafied State, from the outside, there are all these sort of new tools, techniques, right? Like now welfare decisions are being made through automated systems. There are these like algorithms that like determine who should be punished or not, like really high stakes sort of tools and techniques are being brought into perpetuating, dramatizing, exerting state power. So there is that like from the outside, and that looks like that there's something very significant happening here. But when you are sort of behind the scenes, but I think we're also saying it's really not that secretive either. There are a lot of public officials who don't understand the tools that they are using, or who have their own grievances about the way that these tools are brought into their day-to-day work. There's a lot of, which I'm surprised that neither of us have mentioned it yet, like there's a lot of concern around the quality of data, which is my favorite phrase, like the quality, that like nebulous quality of data that we can never attain. So I think right now we're in this moment where things are changing, partly because there's so much like economic interest in trying to transform the state too. So it's not just a question of like politics and sovereignty, but it's also a question of like how more we can grow the tech industry, both in the United States, but I think I think it's true for China, it's true for like at the national level. So we're in this sort of like transition where I always like joke, but as like every joke, it carries a lot of truth in it. That like some of my findings or some of my discussions tend to disappoint people when they want to hear either like a big failure, like a spectacular failure that they can learn from, or like some feel-good story, like, okay, the state tried to do this and people rose up against it. And in most of the time, like in most cases, it's really like somewhere in between. And I feel like people who study the state ethnographically, we kind of deal with that. I mean, not a problem, but like, yeah, like how to make the mundane more spectacular, to really sort of theorize state power. So yeah, like I think I can come up with a lot of examples from like existing scholarship that talks to how there is that like shift in the way that the state exerts its power by relying on these databases and techniques. I can also come up with many examples where it's just a front, and like, you get behind it and it's all just a bunch of numbers that nobody knows what to do with. But I think there is a very significant potential that, the scholars like Marion Fourcade and all like talked about like how the nature of sovereignty, the way that the state sees its populations and places will significantly change as we all become data points or data traces to those who govern us. So I'll stop here.
Chuncheng, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, one thing I realized I've been saying a lot recently is I feel as a sociologist, especially as an ethnographer, I'm not really good at making predictions. I'm horrible at thinking about, well, not thinking about, but like making arguments regarding something that we are facing to some extent. Like, so well, that's a long way to say I don't know. I'm more interested to see how the institution responds to changes, how individuals respond to changes, and I guess it really depends on the perspective. Yeah, I think personally, like as a researcher who did research from that trajectory, I honestly I don't know, and I just really want to say 100% like. Every time I talk about social credit system, like people are kind of firstly like, oh, it's so like, most people have this imagination of how it worked. And then when I talk to them, oh, it doesn't really work like that, then they were like, oh, that's so interesting. It must be a spectacular failure. And then I start to say, oh, no, it's just boring paperwork. And they were like, oh, really? Just that? Yeah, it's like the fundamental, I think one of the fundamental character of any bureaucracy, it's boringness. It's just so boring, and but that's just its nature, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yes, and there's another question in the chat that speaks about the work of other actors besides state, and it's a question from Nayana Kirasur, and I'll just repeat questions myself. Both the talks speak to the everyday routinized work that government functionaries do for and on behalf of the state. I wonder if we can think of how citizens too put in efforts to keep up with the Datafied State. How can we conceptualize the labor that citizens and government workers put in order to maintain state's allure, if I may say so? Given that the rhetoric around use of data is to make governance more efficient and seamless, how do we account for the labor that goes in? And I think, Chuncheng, you spoke about your interactions with citizens and also street level bureaucrats. Burcu, you spoke about these GovTech employees who are doing the mundane labor of digitizing these state materials. So building on top of this question, I was also curious, like how you map and navigate between these different actors that is doing the labor of the Datafied State, if I may so, and what's your experience of moving into these different stakeholders and mapping those stories together in your own analysis?
This is a great question. So I mean, Nayana, it's a great like multi-level question that I'm not sure if I'll be able to answer all the points, but I'll give you one example, especially in relation to like access or how to navigate. So I always describe my field work in Kansas City as multi-sited because it wasn't just the local government office, but I also hung out a lot, like systematically, at the local tech incubator that was really excited about like sort of giving an opportunity for the city's local entrepreneurs to use data to get involved in like local governance in a very neoliberal, like tech entrepreneurial way, which is, I think, I don't think that's the kind of people that Nayana had in mind necessarily, but that was the type of people that the municipality liked to highlight, welcome, not necessarily like the civic hackers or not necessarily the activists on the ground who were actually far more proficient with using data and data analysis. So I think that's one way to think about it. And my GovTech project is actually inspired by what I was seeing there. Like the municipality thought they were doing something civically oriented, whereas those folks were like, ooh, like how can we make money off of government data? Like that sounds like a great opportunity to figure out the next big thing in the industry. So there is, I think, I don't want to use the word labor to describe the work that was being done by those folks, but I want to like sort of put that out there as in that question, like what kind of, like which citizens are we talking about here and who's benefiting from which citizens are at the forefront of this. And then the second very small thing I want to add is, but I care about the labor of GovTech firms because I think in the mundane day-to-day sort of work of, oh, let us just set you up with a nice looking shiny dashboard, like in that act of labor, there are a lot of decisions that they are taking on that like I think public officials don't always understand, and we're able to observe and see how that's being done. But once these systems are established and instituted, it'll be harder to like trace back and understand like what those seemingly technical computing decisions, what interests they were serving and what they are doing to, you know, residents or citizens who are trying to live with the consequences of those tools.
Yeah, so I guess one interesting labor I observed in my fieldwork is, so like the city I studied, they built up an exhibition hall of the social credit system, because again, this is considered as the local innovation, and they really wants to impress all those visitors who come to the city to study their advanced experience. So the one of the neighborhood government official organized a kind of a tour for all those grassroots bureaucrats and me to be there to just see how they frame this kind of whole system in a tour. And there's like a permanent member there, like a tour guide woman who's dressing up very professionally, you know, with all those like mag and smile, and tell us like what to look, where to look, about the glorious history of the local policy development and the system construction. And the tour is supposed to be like 15 minutes, and she just broke out of character in 5 minutes, and she started laughing and say, "Oh, it's so funny to perform this in front of insiders," and we all laughed. And then like it was the whole tour become just ranting on how the system is just performs, right? And but that's a labor, that's a unexpected labor to some extent sustained to maintain this kind of illusion of a functional system. But to whom, right? Like the important question, I guess, is to whom, and why do they need to do that? So that is something I feel like really, really intrigued me. And that's, you know, also the moment I think this is a great question, because again, think about what kind of unexpected human labors are actually actively there to not only trying to make the system work, but also trying to make it looks like it's working when it's not, and really make us to think about maybe the whole point is not to make the system work at all, right? So again, yeah, I think this is a very, very useful perspective.
I think we have time for one more question, and if there's one more question from the chat, specifically thinking about, you know, the relationship between digital ethnography and just ethnography in general. So our working group here is geared towards digital ethnography methods. It's because it was founded during the pandemic times, and everybody, ethnographers, sociologists, were thinking about how we need to redo our methods during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I was wondering also if both of you have experience of doing any digital ethnography, like during the pandemic. Based on your own experience of doing more traditional ethnographic work, what are some of the frictions, I don't know, or benefits of doing digital ethnography, if you have any experience of doing so?
So I taught last semester a class on digital ethnography, and I noticed that I never use the word conservative to describe myself, but when it comes to ethnography, I came to accept my conservative tendencies. That I think it's really important to have that like embodied on the ground experience. And my, original like book dissertation / book project was like very much what I would call an urban ethnography rather than digital. That said, since, the topics that we're dealing with are like sort of very digitally oriented, I definitely took advantage of I don't know, like before the pandemic, I was conducting Zoom interviews with some of my interlocutors because they preferred to be more online than show up like at a place. Or, they used to send me their demos of the technical tools that they were trying to build. Like, I didn't even get into this. Like, one of my go-to examples to really illustrate the hype and reality of a smart city is a pothole predictor that came out of the pilot that I worked on. So when on the way to building that pothole predictor, there were a lot of demos and discussions that we kind of digitally interacted with. And during the pandemic, actually, I experienced with this COVID dashboards project, like I really tried hard to think about like how to ethnographically study dashboards. And I have this like conference paper from last year that I don't know what it, if it's going to become a publication or not, but I'm happy to share if anyone's interested, like how to like deal with this two-dimensional so-called, interactive data visualization tool ethnographically while trying to sort of get behind it and talk to people who create those systems. So yeah, I know it's not a great answer, but I think I very much respect digital methods and I try to make use of it, but I'm noticing that I don't necessarily define the work around it. And maybe that'll change as the state becomes more datafied.
Yeah, I feel today a lot of questions. I don't really have anything to add on because I have exactly the same answer. Yeah, so I also feel I'm more conservative in terms of ethnography. I do feel the embodiment is important part, and a lot of those things I don't think I would ever find out if I was not there, and if I was not there for a long time when they start to just do whatever they want and do whatever they usually do and just let me to observe as a rod in the corner, like so I don't know. During the COVID, I also did some COVID project, but I would call them interview-based research instead of ethnography. And that's how. So I don't know, but maybe there will be more Datafied State, and there will be new method to study it. But before that, I don't know. But also I feel, well, important thing for me to think about digital ethnography is to think about what makes things become digital. And I think that's where ethnography is very useful, because digital world doesn't exist by itself. Something has to be translated into digital form, and all those kind of, you call it labor, or you call it, whatever you want to call it, those social activities, most of the time around the state are still organized as an organizational practice where there is a site you can just go and see. So and that's kind of that's the part I think I'm doing about semi-digital ethnography. Yeah.
Thank you again to our panelists, and thank you everyone for staying up until the end of this talk. And we'll hopefully gonna continue this discussion elsewhere. And again, thank you for joining us, Burcu and Chuncheng, and I'll see you all in our next public events. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Young Rim. Take care, everybody.